be in this ongoing standoff right now?
Well, the basic problem that we face is that we have no way of winning this war. And to be honest, we're going to, in all likelihood, suffer a catastrophic defeat. I do believe that with the passage of time, this war will be viewed as the greatest foreign policy disaster in American history. And much time will be spent on asking the question, how could President Trump have been so foolish to attack Iran on February 28th? And of course, President Trump understands the situation that he's in. You can see him flailing around. Uh, and the reason is because he has no off ramp here. There's no way he could even get out of this war with a limited victory. Forget a total victory. He can't even gain a limited victory. He's going to suffer, or the United States is going to suffer a decisive defeat. And for him to say this is frustrating would, really underestimate how bad the situation is for him. As I like to say, this reminds me a lot of what happened to Lyndon Johnson during the Vietnam War, because Johnson understood as the war went along that there was no way we could win it. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were ultimately going to prevail. And that destroyed his presidency. And I would argue it destroyed him as an individual. He was badly wounded by his experience in Vietnam. And I think you see a similar situation with President Trump. He is being worn down by the war. And the end result is that his behavior has become, to put it in generous terms, more erratic than ever. And he is saying things that just make no sense at all. Many of the things he says are contradicted by hard facts. I mean, some of the comments that he's made about the conditions on the USS Abraham Lincoln are belied by the facts, and everybody understands that. And then he's out talking about attacking Oman, which is very friendly to the United States and has been working hard to mediate between Iran and the United States. And there's absolutely no reason to be talking about attacking Oman. But I think he's doing that because he's desperate, and it's bringing this desperation is bringing out his worst characteristics. And I would say, Rachel, and I hope I'm wrong, but I think the situation with President Trump is only going to get worse because it's going to become more apparent as time goes by, not only that we have no options for winning this war in any way, but also that this will be a catastrophic defeat.
Yeah, it absolutely seems that way. And interesting to see too how you were describing it, the effects that this war can have on Trump as a person. And yeah, when you look at his options, I know that there's been talk in recent weeks about the US military carrying out some kind of a major attack, but then came the warnings about munition shortages and the concerns from the region that would be impacted by Iran's retaliatory attacks. All of these Gulf countries that are like, hey, you didn't check in with us before you launched this war back in February. Maybe we should have a bit more of a say before you go into another round of it. And I thought it was interesting that not only is Iran now demanding the US follow the terms of the MOU, they're adding to those terms. They're demanding the US military get out of the region. They're calling for a ceasefire that includes not just Lebanon, but also the Palestinians in Gaza. When you look at what Trump could do here, as you were noting, there is no victory plan, there's no trump card, so to speak, against Iran. But what options does he really have? And is there an off ramp here?
No, the only off ramp is conceding to the Iranians. Just to put a finer point on what you said, the Iranians are not interested at this point in negotiating about most of their key demands. They are saying to the United States that you have to meet all of our key demands. And I want to underline the word all. You have to meet all of our key demands before we'll open the strait. And at that point, the only issue that will be left to negotiate is the nuclear issue. And of course, we will have no bargaining leverage because we will have given away the farm just to get the straits open. So the situation that President Trump faces today is worse than the situation that he faced when he signed the memorandum of understanding on June 17th, because then we had to make some concessions up front in the memorandum of understanding, but most of the key issues were to be negotiated in the 60-day period, which of course ended yesterday. But now the Iranians are driving a much harder bargain. So for President Trump, it's hard to see what he can do um, without, in effect, surrendering on all these key issues to the Iranians. And very importantly, and this cannot be underestimated uh, enough or overestimated enough, he's leaving the nuclear issue hanging. I mean, the nuclear issue was of enormous importance. And one of the reasons we went to war last June against Iran was to deal with the nuclear issue. And one of the reasons we went to war on February 28th, one of the key reasons was to deal with the nuclear issue. And now the nuclear issue is hardly talked about at all. And the Iranians want to leave it to the very end when we won't have any bargaining leverage. So you have to understand, everybody has to understand just how much trouble we're in here.
Yeah, especially when you look at the Trump administration, they seem to think that they can make a deal and then they'll get a better deal the next time around when they violate the current agreement. But as you're describing there, yeah, the MOU was a surrender document in some ways for the US, but better than what they're looking at if they want to make another agreement with Iran. And I wanted to get into the economic angle a little bit because I also thought it was interesting that the Trump administration now seems to want to focus on the economic war, right? There's been this push to just say, okay, we're going to continue an indefinite naval blockade, we're going to focus on the sanctions, and there has been a lot of talk about secondary sanctions, which of course, if imposed, would target mainly China. And this comes at the same time that you have the US Senate recently passing the Lindsey Graham Sanctioning Russia and Iran Act of 2026, which would include measures targeting top purchasers of Russian energy exports, such as China and India. Are you surprised to see this renewed push for secondary sanctions, and what kind of an impact could it have on the global economy if the US does go down this road?
Well, I don't think the United States is going to go down this road. Trump forced Congress to water down the bill so that he has a great deal of discretion. And if it ever does get through, both the Senate and the House and is sent to him, he'll probably sign it because it gives him so much discretion. And then he won't do much about it. Uh, Given the state of the international economy, I think he's not going to impose secondary sanctions on countries like China and India and cause all sorts of problems on those fronts. And furthermore, um, if you look at what's happening in the Gulf from an economic point of view, and you marry that to what's happening in the bond market these days, where we see flashing orange lights, I think the last thing that President Trump is going to want to do is impose secondary sanctions on countries like China and India. So I think this is not a big problem. I think that the big problem we face is that there are all sorts of indicators that the international economy is in real trouble. It's not just the inflation alone that comes from the fact that the Gulf and now the Red Sea have been both shut down in substantial ways. It's also the fact that if you look at the bond market, or I should say the bond markets in countries all across the world, countries like Japan, Britain, and certainly the United States, they're flashing orange lights there. The yields are going up, and this will cause all sorts of problems for countries to service their debts. And this, coupled with what's going on in the Gulf, and which shows no signs of ending in the Gulf, is a cause of serious concern. I can't believe that the president and his advisors, especially someone like Scott Bessent, isn't sitting around now talking about how important it is to put an end to what's going on in the Gulf as quickly as possible so that we don't crash the international economy. Um, if you look at what's happening in Iran, it's quite clear that the hardliners have taken control. Almost everybody agrees with that. And when you listen to what people in the Supreme National Security Council of Iran are saying, they're talking about going on the offense in the future. Their view is that the best defense is a good offense. In the past, the Iranians have been largely reactive to what the Americans did. Uh, but that's no longer the case. The Americans basically have their hands tied because of the munitions crisis. So we're not interested in going on the offensive and using military force to get back to a tit for tat campaign or anything like that. We're trying to avoid a tit for tat campaign. But what the Iranians are saying is that we want to up the ante. We want to behave much more offensively. We want to be more proactive in terms of the use of military force in the Gulf and, of course, in the Red Sea as well. And if they are effective, and there's good reason to think that they will be effective, this will just make the economic situation as it relates to the Gulf worse. And when you marry that to what's happening in the bond markets and in the international economy overall, there is serious cause for concern here. Now, one might say, well, we can do X, Y, and Z to fix this situation and head trouble off at the pass. Well, I don't see any X, Y, and Z, and I read the papers quite carefully. And it's apparent that all sorts of people, especially in the financial world, are really worried about where we are headed. So I think there will be very powerful pressures brought to bear on President Trump uh, in the immediate future, if they're not already being brought to bear on him to shut this war down as quickly as possible. And then we go back to where we started. How does he shut the war down? He basically concedes on almost all points to the Iranians, which one would imagine is almost impossible for him to conceive of doing. But then again, what is the choice that he has at this point? If you look at the choices that President Trump faces, it basically is to continue this war and flirt with catastrophe, or to end it on humiliating terms, to accept the fact that we have been badly defeated. That's the choice set here, as best I can tell.
Yeah, and it's also the question of how soon does he make that choice, right? How much further does he get into this hole before starting to try to back out of it? And I know we were talking before we started recording about this situation, and you had referenced a New York Times article that was out today. And they specifically noted that a bond sell off has sent borrowing costs to their highest levels since 2007. And the yield on the 30-year US Treasury bond rose on Tuesday to 5.3%, with similar bonds in Canada, Japan, Germany, and elsewhere also trading at their highest yields in at least a decade. And it's interesting because in this report, they reference Fred about inflation, deficits, and AI spending. And I know that for many Americans, right, we have not felt the true pain of this war. Yeah, gas prices have gone up a little bit, but the Trump administration has worked really hard to try to keep everything steady, whether that's looking at the stock market or looking at oil prices. We only have so much when it comes to our strategic petroleum reserves. There's only so much that Trump and some of those over at Axios can do to try to game the stock market and convince everyone that everything is okay. Do you think the American people fully realize what could be coming as we get further into this crisis and as the US financial industry starts to feel the pain of this war?
No, I don't think most Americans fully appreciate it. Part of the problem is it's very hard to predict where an economy is headed. And I think that most people just have not grasped the fact that there's potential for disaster here if bond yields go up or continue to go up in a significant way. You want to remember, we have this multi-trillion dollar debt that we have to finance it. We have to finance, and you finance that debt with bonds in large part. And if the yields on bonds go way up, it becomes very expensive, if not at some point almost impossible to finance that debt. So we are, staring a dire situation in the face, I believe. And I'm not an economics major, or I wasn't an economic major in graduate school or as an undergraduate, so I don't know that much economics. But the people who I talk to in the business world, or people who have PhDs in economics, all see this problem and all worry about this problem. So it's not something that I'm making up. It's for real. And I think if you look at that lead article in the New York Times that you're referencing, Rachel, you see that there are orange flashing lights at play here. I want to make one other point to you, just on this whole issue of how to settle this conflict in Iran or with Iran. The Trump administration is relying very heavily on a naval blockade. We obviously don't want to go back to a tit for tat air campaign, and certainly not a major air campaign like the one that we waged at the beginning of the war. So we're now down to, employing a naval blockade to bring the Iranians to the point where they're willing to surrender to our demands or give up on their more extreme demands. And the question you have to ask yourself is, how likely is it that our Navy, given the condition that it's in, can implement a protracted blockade? Now, in a very important way, all blockades are protracted, so I really don't have to say a protracted blockade, but I said it that way because I want to convey to the audience that if we're going to bring the Iranians to accommodate us in any way in terms of cutting the deal with a blockade, that's going to take a long time. It's going to take many months, if not a few years. And the problem that we face is that it's quite clear that the U.S. Navy is in very bad shape, that we have a Navy that has been pushed to the limit and is not well suited for a long-term blockade. So I think the idea that we can get something out of this war via the blockade is a misguided thought. And this, again, is why I think that we are in a situation where we have little choice but to accept almost all, if not all, of Iran's demands.
Yeah, and I guess that's a reminder too of why Trump is saying the exact opposite, right? He's like, there's no crisis on board the USS Abraham Lincoln. Don't ask us about why they're now coming home. Granted, they're in their ninth month at sea. But yeah, you look at the position that the US is in, and if I were one of the states in the Persian Gulf, I would be looking around going, okay, maybe we need a new partner here because this idea that you host a US military base and it provides protection for your country turned out to be not only not true, but made them a target for Iran's retaliatory strikes. And I know that now we're getting the reports saying that the governments from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain are united in their aggravation with the Trump administration. When you look at the position that the Persian Gulf region is in here, how do you see it? Could there be more pushback against the US? Is there going to be really a natural decline of US military presence because all this damage has been done to their bases and now they're kind of on their way out to a certain extent? Or is there more to it when it comes to that relationship and the future of it?
Well, I would point out, Rachel, that there are two sides who are playing this game. You're talking about whether or not the Gulf states want the United States to continue to have bases on their territory. The other side is whether or not the United States wants to put bases or rebuild its bases in the Persian Gulf once this war comes to an end. And I think the United States will be very reluctant to rebuild those bases. First of all, it'll cost an enormous amount of money, but in addition, if you get into another war, those bases will be eliminated very quickly. One thing that's happened here is that over time, and if you go back to the June 2025 war, and then you ramp forward to February 28th and the 40-day war that took place between February 28th and April 8th, and then you ramp forward to the present, what you see is that Iran's missile capability has improved greatly along the way. Not only do they have lots of missiles, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, but those ballistic missiles are very accurate. I think the Chinese and the Russians are helping them in that regard, but they have very accurate missiles that have potent warheads, and those missiles can maneuver. And on top of that, when you think about the ability of the Gulf states, Israel, and the United States to shoot down those ballistic missiles, the incoming ballistic missiles have a great advantage over the defensive missiles that the Gulf states, the Israelis, and the Americans have. The cost exchange ratio clearly favors the incoming ballistic missiles. And furthermore, putting aside the cost exchange ratio, shooting down an incoming ballistic missile that can maneuver is a very difficult task. And again, those defensive missiles are much more expensive than the incoming missiles. So you have a situation where in the future, what I'm saying here is in the future, the Iranians are going to build an even bigger and more lethal ballistic missile capability. So if you're talking about putting American bases back into places like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and so forth and so on, you're going to have to put defenses in there with them. And I don't think you can find enough money to build a defense that stands a good chance against all those incoming warheads. And I'm not even sure that even if you had all the money in the world, you could build enough uh, defensive missiles to deal with the Iranian ballistic missile and cruise missile threat. So I think from an American point of view, it's almost a hopeless cause. I mean, I may be wrong here. We may have some magic formula for dealing with this problem that nobody's told any of us about. But it just seems to me that our incentives, the United States' incentives for rebuilding those bases and defending those bases in a better way moving forward, not really a serious option. And then you get to the issue that you were raising. It's hard to imagine that these countries want those bases back there on their territory. And I take it a step further, Rachel. The question is, do they want to really have a close alliance with the United States? It's not just the bases. Do you want to have a close alliance with the United States? We've watched the United States since February 28th. Does the United States look like a reliable partner for you that can provide security when you live in a dangerous neighborhood? I don't think so. I think these countries at this point in time, for good strategic reasons, want to distance themselves from the United States. The United States looks like a wild and crazy state that has caused them huge problems that they didn't need. So, given where they are today and thinking about where they will be tomorrow, I don't think they have much of an interest in staying close to us and encouraging us to put those bases back together so that we can use them again.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I almost wonder too if some of those Gulf states are going, oh darn, the US military base here was destroyed. I don't know what we're going to do, right? Looking at Washington like, well, we did what we could. Now, I wanted to go back to a point that you made earlier about the situation that Iran is in and kind of what we're hearing from them, because they really do seem to be indicating that they are preparing for the next phase of war here. We see that in the latest appointments with their new security chief, their new members of their military leadership. We also see it in the rhetoric coming from Iran. When it comes to the concept of Iran going on the offensive, right, carrying out preemptive strikes, how do you see that? Is that something we could actually see? And what do you think that they are weighing when it comes to the cost and benefits of something like taking the war into their own hands and really controlling the next phase?
It's hard to say exactly what they would do. I think you already see evidence that they are becoming more aggressive in terms of attacking ships that are coming through the Strait of Hormuz without permission from Iran. I think they're working closely with the Houthis to help the Houthis shut down the Bab el-Mandab Strait as much as possible, but certainly to limit the amount of Saudi oil that comes out of the Red Sea through the Bab el-Mandab Strait. Uh, so I think the attacks on shipping will go up. I also think that what you'll see in all likelihood is an attack on oil installations in places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. As you know, the uh, uh, the UAE is getting a lot of oil out of a place called Fujairah, and because Fujairah is a port that is outside of the Strait of Hormuz. It's a UAE port that's outside the Strait of Hormuz. I wouldn't be surprised if the Iranians tried to shut down Fujairah. I wouldn't be surprised if the Iranians tried to shut down Yanbu. That's the Saudi port on the Red Sea. And shutting down Yanbu, going after installations inside of Saudi Arabia, oil installations inside of Saudi Arabia, and then working with the Houthis to keep pressure on the